Chapter 3.
3. Embassy. When one imagines a vampire embassy, one imagines a medieval castle with blood-red flags shaped like bats that flap menacingly on top of sharp towers, towers that loom over the city under an enormous white moon. One does not imagine a 4 stories tall commercial building that, aside from the embassy, also houses an open all-hours electric store, a souvenir shop, and something called the Pet Palace. There it is. Saul called like a tour guide. He crossed the street backwards so not to miss seeing the disappointment on my face. The embassy. What do you think? I had no words to share, which made him chuckle. What? Not goth enough. I put my eyes on the Pet Palace. Is that a pet shop? Saul shrugged, still grinning. You know, with the real estate prices being what they are. And it didn't get better when inside. We took an old, flickering light-style elevator up to the 4th floor and found ourselves in an accounting firm-ish lobby, surrounded by white and glass walls, heading toward a receptionist. She was sitting behind her desk, apparently bored out of her mind, lazily eyeing the computer screen that lit her pale white face mildly blue. She did not bother to give us a look, not until we were right in front of her. Then she glanced at Saul, who was smiling like the morning sun. Rebecca. Saul called, as if they were old buddies. Rebecca, void of emotion, stared at him for a second and then tilted her head toward me. This better not be one of yours, she said, about as lively as dust in the attic. It stung me quite a bit to be referred to as this. I took a step forward, planning to introduce myself. She was, after all, beautiful, but Saul blocked my way with his hand. He did not look at me. His focus remained on that rude receptionist. Oh, Becky. You must get out of this place, I tell you. I'd rather take a year underground than a life here. If this one is one of yours, Rebecca said, hint of warning in her voice, underground might be exactly where you're heading. She wasn't angry though, more annoyed. She put her hand through her blonde hair, not in a flirtatious manner, more like Saul was giving her a headache. Saul did not let his smile fade. I'm a loving guy. What can I do? This made Rebecca raise her voice. You can follow the law. Like everyone else. Saul shrugged. Guess I'm not like everyone else. Is the old man in? Rebecca gave him another staring down and then returned her eyes onto the computer screen. Yeah, she said, gesturing toward one of the white doors of which there were 4, good luck. Saul turned to me, his smile fading at last. Okay, let's do it. As Saul opened the door, I turned to give Rebecca one more glance. She was slowly shaking her head, whispering something I could not hear. But I didn't need to hear it. Her opinion was already clear enough. You should have just let this one die, Saul. You should have let it die. The room we headed into was just as boring as everything else in the pet shop/vampire embassy building, grey walls and what have you, but the man sitting across the table looked like a rather formidable one, and much more supernatural. He had a certain dignity about him that came with age, which, in his case, may have been in the hundreds, and a cool set of long silver hair with a matching silver beard. He may have made a better wizard than vampire, but by that point, I was joyed by any hint to the supernatural. Like a disappointed father to Saul, he shook his head right away and mumbled something disproving. Whatever it was, he did get Saul to stop smiling. After a moment, he continued more audibly. This can't keep happening, Saul. Rules are rules. I need an exception, Bart. Bart kept shaking his old and wise head. I can't. It was an emergency, I'm sure they will. No, Saul. Not anymore. They are cracking down on numbers. We are on the verge of breaking the treaty. They will not forgive. Saul glanced at me. There wasn't any real concern on his face yet. Treaty with the witches, he told me, we're supposed to keep our numbers on a certain level. Yes. The old man yelled. You do know the rules. You have heard and you understand. Still, you go and do this. Seriously, Bart. It's one guy. Bart shook his head, pulled out a quill, not a pen. I got quite the supernatural kick out of seeing that, and started marking a paper. I have to punish you. No more special treatment. Saul sighed, but the man ignored him. Instead, Bart turned to me. Name? It kind of shook me to be addressed so suddenly, but I gathered my thought quick enough. Thomas. Thomas what? Stowefeld. Hearing that, his quill hand froze, and his eyes moved upward, but about as slowly as the trees grow. What did you say? Stowefeld. S-T-O. He turned in his seat, it had been a rolling chair, and started opening metal drawers. I looked at Saul and he looked back. He seemed about as aware of what was happening as I was. What's up, Bart? Saul asked, some concern breaking into his tone. But the old man just kept searching for something. It was about a minute later when he stopped and pulled out a large, A3 size, file folder. He scanned it with shaky fingers and called out to me. Edison Stowefeld? Do you know him? Hearing the name was certainly strange and surprising. Edison? Yes. He's my uncle. What's he got to do? Bart jumped up as if having sat on some magical thumbtack. Crazy eyes, he looked at me and then to Saul, and then back to me. With me, if you will, Mr. Stowefeld? He said, walking to the door. Saul will stay here. There was no longer a joke on Saul's face. His lips only mimicked the word go. It was pretty clear that whatever was happening wasn't to the norm. But for some reason, I was still far from being frightened. If anything, it felt like things were finally starting to get interesting. So I did follow out the door, through the waiting room and down a long, dimly lit hallway. In the end, we reached a much more vampire-ish room. It was dark and humid, and its stone walls gave it the look of a cave. Bart sat on a bench and gestured me to join him. By that point, his madness had lessened, and he spoke in an almost childish voice. What a night, eh? To you and to us all, really. If you say so. He tapped some rhythm on his old knees before continuing. This turning of yours. It was voluntary, yes? I guess. I mean, I wasn't exactly aware of it. I was dead. But yeah, I'm glad he did it. That's good. Saul's a good guy. Rash sometimes, but good. Yeah. Sure. So, you were dead? An accident, perhaps? I doubt it. I don't really remember. Bart nodded so much it felt like he didn't believe me at all. It would be very good if we knew. I second that. I can show you, you know. I could make you see. Really? Do you want to see? Sure, I mean. But I could not say the rest. The old man pressed his index finger onto my forehead, about where the bullet had hit, and I was suddenly back in my apartment. I could see myself messing with the keys, which never seemed to fit into the lock when drunk, enter the corridor, kick off my shoes, and then zigzag my way toward the kitchen. But then, out of nowhere, my way was blocked by a mountain of a man. He was in a dark overcoat and had a watermelon of a face covered in scars. And he was pointing a gun at me. And before I could react in any way, he spoke. Find the Red Cove. And that was it. He had most likely pulled the trigger right after, for I returned into the embassy room. Bart was already on his feet, heading toward the door. Who the hell was that? I called to his backside. He stopped for a moment, not turning around. Don't worry about that. Your uncle will be here soon. And I could ask no more before he was gone. I was left sitting, wondering what the hell did my uncle have to do with anything? In that deep thought, I checked the door to see if it was locked, which it wasn't, and walked back and forth in the room trying to decide if I should make a run for it, or if that could be considered an overreaction. Before I could decide, the door reopened, and from it, I could see the silhouette of who I had always thought to be crazy, uncle. He didn't appear as mad then. Hair combed over his head and dressed in a nice suit, he looked pretty badass, like a mafioso. Come, Thomas. He called, very serious and maybe even concerned. And he started walking. But I started to get dizzy. And sick. And angry. It was like I was returning to the hangover of the transition into a vampire. I followed my uncle shakily as everything started to hum and turn foggy, and I grabbed from my head as an ache similar to an ice pick stabbing punctured my skull. Thoughts and ideas seemed to run away from me. So, by the time we reached the waiting room, I had to keep repeating to myself the name Saul, just so not to forget about him. As I stood there, trying to maintain control, my uncle was pointing his finger at Bart. "You'll be hearing from us." But that didn't really matter to me. Between all the pains, I managed to open my mouth. And I was as loud as one can be. "Where's Saul?" I demanded. That got some eyes on me, but did not get Saul back. "I'm not leaving without him," I shouted again. Everyone looked at my uncle. He sighed and shrugged like whatever. And then Saul appeared, whiter than I had ever seen him, and more humble looking. He didn't say a word to me but rushed toward the elevator. The ride down was a silent one, if not counting the rumble in my chest. My heart was pounding like a freaking war drum. And there was a wild desire inside me growing stronger by the second, a need to rip and slash, to play and kill, to feed. As we got to the street, I could only see as much as through a needle pin. An ancient part of me was prepping to do its own thing. Saul and Uncle were facing each other. "I'm so sorry, sir," Saul pleaded, terrified. "Save it. This is your end, you cancer of nature." And then I was an animal. A strong and fast one. The most determined and target-minded monster on the planet. I slammed into my uncle, digging my fangs into his neck, in so deep they might as well have exited from the other side, and sucked with all I had. And I ripped and I clawed, breaking his bones, and tearing him apart. And then, suddenly I was again my fun-loving self. I dropped his depleted body on the asphalt and looked at Saul with the sincerest smile. I felt freaking great. I was as light as a feather and as mighty as a sword. Stars in the sky and souls in hell, they were all mine to be played with. But Saul was much gloomier, annoyingly so. He was kind of ruining my high. "What the hell did you do?" he shouted, pointing at the messy carcass. I looked at my uncle. He was like an empty bottle of ketchup. Who cares about an empty bottle? Saul shook his head, looking up, probably to the windows of the embassy, and then stepped over the guts to beside me. He put his hand on my shoulder and spoke, almost breathlessly. "We have to get out of here." And as he desired, happened. Suddenly we were like the wind, fast and invisible, blowing down the street and all the way out of town.